Aftermath of Israeli air raids are visible in this village in southern Lebanon. Several civilians were killed and also a Hezbollah militant a few kilometers away, according to the official Lebanese news agency.
The war between the Israeli military and Hezbollah keeps moving beyond the border. Targeted strikes, deeper inside Lebanon and kilometers away from the battleground, are becoming more frequent.
God damn it, world! How many times do I have to tell you to wait until I'm ready to publish a video about a place before you start doing shit there? How else am I supposed to capitalize on tragedy? Fine then, we'll do it live! But do I really want to go down the Lebanon hole again? Welcome! This video is the first installment in a new series all about the First Lebanon War. Now, I'm certain some of you more astute, intelligent, and may I say, attractive viewers in the audience might be wondering, haven't you covered the First Lebanon War before? And the answer is, sort of. A couple of years ago, I made a 6-part series about the Lebanese Civil War, which I later edited into a 3.5-hour supercut. Though the Lebanese Civil War overlaps, intertwines, and to some degree is a cause of the First Lebanon War, it is a separate conflict. The Lebanese Civil War, or more precisely the Second Lebanese Civil War, was an internal conflict within Lebanon over the division of political power, while the First Lebanon War was a conflict between the State of Israel and various political factions operating out of southern Lebanon. The First Lebanon War was one of numerous foreign interventions into the Lebanese Civil War, which continued on after the Civil War ended. The First Lebanon War was the second of 3 Israeli invasions of Lebanon, which I personally think should be numbered like this, but unfortunately previous historians have already decided this should be the numbering, and so in order to avoid confusion, I'm just going to go with the conventional naming standard. But given this timeline, you will see that I have already covered the first half of the First Lebanon War, and so if you want more detail about that, you could either watch this 3.5-hour long video here, or you can watch these 4 30+ minute videos here. And in this series, we're going to mostly be covering the 90s up to Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon in the year 2000. But just so this series is self-contained, let me give you an abridged history of the conflict up to 1990. In 1967, the Israelis preempted a planned attack by Egypt in Syria by knocking out the Egyptian Air Force, and by the end of the war managed to drive Egypt out of Gaza and the Sinai, Jordan out of the West Bank, and Syria out of the Golan Heights. This triggered a second wave of Palestinians to go into exile into the neighboring Arab states, with Jordan and Lebanon receiving the largest share. The PLO then attempted to overthrow King Hussein, which resulted in a brutal crackdown by the Jordanian government in 1970, referred to as Black September. This forced Yasser Arafat and other leaders of the PLO to relocate to Lebanon, where large numbers of Palestinians had settled in refugee camps around Beirut, as well as in villages in the south near the border with Israel. From here, the PLO and other Palestinian militant groups wage a terror campaign against Israelis within Israel as well as against Israeli officials and basically any Jew anywhere in the world. Their most infamous tactic was firing Katyusha rockets at civilians in northern Israel. The Israelis would retaliate against these attacks with commando raids, assassinations, and strategic airstrikes. Lebanese civilians tended to get caught in the crossfire, which eventually led the Maronite Christians of Lebanon to attack the Palestinians, with the Muslims of Lebanon taking up arms in their defense, thus triggering the Lebanese Civil War. The fighting in Lebanon didn't stop the PLO from continuing to launch terror attacks against Israel, with one attack in 1978 being so horrific that the IDF invaded Lebanon in order to disrupt their operations. A ceasefire was eventually negotiated and the Israelis would withdraw, allowing an international force under the auspices of the UN to take its place. UNIFIL was tasked with restoring stability to southern Lebanon, but due to its general lack of initiative, it never stopped the terror or rocket attacks. These continued until a string of assassinations between 1981 and 1982 made the Israeli government intervene again in a much larger operation. There were conflicting goals between the politicians, who wanted to occupy enough of southern Lebanon so that the PLO's Katyusha rockets were pushed out of range of Israeli territory, and the IDF, who wanted to go further, with Defense Minister Ariel Sharon wanting regime change in Lebanon by capturing the capital of Beirut and installing a pro-Israeli government that could sign a peace treaty with Israel as Egypt had done 3 years earlier. When making war plans, the IDF gave Prime Minister Begin an option that had a minimal occupation of southern Lebanon, all the while knowing that the reality on the ground would most likely necessitate going further, thus allowing for Sharon's full-blown plan to be implemented. The Battle of Beirut would be brutal and only ended when another international force, led by the US, escorted the PLO out of Lebanon. But shortly after they withdrew, one of Israel's Maronite allies, the Lebanese forces, orchestrated a massacre of the Palestinians at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. This created massive international backlash against Israel and led President Reagan to send the Marines back into Beirut, which was also the beginning of a slow Israeli withdrawal. Hafez al-Assad, whose forces had been in Lebanon since 1976, began arming various Lebanese factions to pressure international forces out of Lebanon, with the US, France, Italy, and UK pulling their forces out in the winter of 1984.
With the failures of the Lebanon intervention and the Reagan Plan, Secretary of State George Shultz scaled back U.S. diplomacy in the region. We would not send troops into Middle East trouble spots or outline comprehensive plans for resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Rather, we would focus on getting peace talks started. Or if the Arabs and Israelis could not even talk, the conflict would never end. Instead, it would threaten both to escalate dangerously and to disrupt the world oil market and the U.S. economy.
And although the Reagan administration was trying to scale down its involvement in the Middle East, I would like to scale up my membership enrollment on Patreon. This video is not sponsored, and you might be seeing more like this in the future from me as well as other educational YouTube channels as the advertising space kinda changes behind the scenes. Regardless of that, I would love to depend more on my Patreon for support rather than sponsors or AdSense, and cater my videos to what you guys and myself think is more interesting, rather than simply catering to what sponsors or advertisers think is safe. And this year, I have a particular goal for the Patreon. You see, Patreon has a bunch of features in order to help creators service their patrons, but not all features are available to all creators. Currently, if you sign up for my Patreon, you'll be signing up for a monthly subscription service. But I've had current members of my Patreon, as well as people who have expressed interest, ask if I could offer an annual membership, and I would gladly do that. But Patreon doesn't allow that feature, at least not for my creator page at this time. You see, in order to get access to that feature, you have to reach a certain monetary threshold. Namely, you have to be getting at least $200 a month from Patreon for at least 3 consecutive months in order to offer that. I've hit that $200 mark several times, but I've never been able to maintain it for long enough to get access to this feature. And that's something I would really like to do this year. As of writing this video, the Patreon is currently at $189, so I'm still short. If 11 of you signed up for $1 a month, or 6 of you signed up for $2 a month, or 3 of you signed up for $5 a month, if 2 of you signed up for $10 a month, or if 1 person signed up for $20 a month and maintained it for 3 months, I could get access to that feature and offer you guys more. It'll give me more financial security for YouTube and allow me to spend more time worrying about making good videos rather than worrying about the finances. And by signing up for the Patreon, you get access to a number of perks, such as getting to watch ad and sponsor-free versions of this video, meaning that this current segment you're watching right now on YouTube isn't included in the Patreon version. They get a clean, straight to the point version. You guys have to put up with a little bit of this simply because this is a business. I need to make it sustainable. But patrons get access to a version of the video without all of these sponsors and plugs. They also get access to the videos early so they can watch them before anyone else does. Patrons of various levels can also get access to the scripts and notes that I use to make these videos, as well as getting their name in the chyron during the end screen of the video. And of course, they all get access to a patrons-only Discord. I know in the end, most people support creators on Patreon not because they're expecting or super looking forward to the benefits. The benefits are mostly ways for us, the creators, to express our gratitude to you patrons. But ultimately, we know the reason why you support them is because you want to see the content they make. You think what they create has value and you want to see more of it. And if that's the case for you, then I suggest signing up. You can really help a lot. If any of this sounds of interest to you, then you can sign up at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Pick a tier that's right for you and support the channel. Help me make more videos in the future. It really does help. But for now, let's get back to the history. But in the mid to late 80s, the U.S. would begin working with Arab entities more covertly. At U.S. encouragement, the Jordanians began working with Arafat and the PLO in order to create some kind of representation for the Palestinians at future talks with Israel. Arafat and the PLO would adopt the Algiers Declaration in 1988, committing them to renounce terrorism and accept a two-state solution. Even the Syrians began to change their tune. Hafez al-Assad would visit Moscow in 1987, where Mikhail Gorbachev told him that the Soviet Union would no longer support military parity between Syria and Israel. With its primary arms supplier on collision course with dissolution, Syria began tilting its policies toward the U.S., often serving as a mediator between the U.S. and the various terrorists and militias in Lebanon. And by the early 90s, the kidnapping crisis was largely over, as the Civil War ended as well. The Israelis would withdraw to a strip of territory along the border they referred to as the security zone, occasionally striking outside the zone at terrorist headquarters and training camps. The Israelis would spend the rest of the 80s fighting a Shiite insurgency led by Amal, which was armed by Syria, and Hezbollah, who were proxies of Iran. The civil war was ended by the signing of the Taif Agreement in Saudi Arabia in late 1989, which redistributed power within the Lebanese government to be more equitable, all the while promising to eventually abolish the sectarian system at some undetermined point in the future. It also mandated that all militias be disarmed, but under Syrian pressure, an exception was added for Hezbollah, allowing any and all means to be used if it was in pursuit of liberating Lebanon from foreign occupiers. Although this language technically implicated the Syrians and UNIFIL as well, everyone understood that the Israelis were the only foreign power this would be applied to. Hezbollah would reorganize itself in order to take advantage of all of this territory that the Israelis ceded as they fell backward to the security zone along the border. And they would blanket these cities in posters, pamphlets, flags, and all sorts of other propaganda, emphasizing what the leaders of Hezbollah called a society of resistance. They also made the local populace dependent on them with various welfare programs paid for by Iran. Hezbollah's social welfare network astutely filled the void left by a neglectful Lebanese state, deliberately creating a culture of dependency that bonded Lebanese Shias to the organization. Throughout the 90s, those that joined had a variety of motivations. Those from the south tended to be motivated more by anti-Israeli nationalism, while those in the north tended to be more religiously motivated, supporting Hezbollah's goal of establishing an Islamic state in Lebanon. And the religious motivations shouldn't be ignored or downplayed. As one Hezbollah member told a Western journalist in the 90s,
"It is difficult for you to understand because you are not a Muslim. Martyrdom is a religious and philosophical concept. We are born to get acquainted with God. Our goal of living is to reach God. This is done by death. We are all going to die, but each person has a choice of how to die. The way we lead our life dictates our death. According to Islam, the best way to die is to die for God."
And when it came to Muslim recruits, they weren't picky, with children as young as 6 being subject to indoctrination classes. And although they didn't officially accept members below the age of 18, they established numerous youth organizations that taught minors the basics of weapons use and maintenance. Hezbollah also embraced modern media, filming their attacks against Israeli and SLA outposts and broadcasting it on a TV station they owned and operated, which would get picked up by the Israeli TV channels and rebroadcast, thus weakening public resolve for the war. But the Israelis weren't just sitting on their hands. Most of the IDF's training was centered around sending troops on rotation in Lebanon. But for many, it was a thankless task, with one IDF veteran describing it as a kind of poverty. Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, described his experience serving in Lebanon.
Serving in the reserves of the 1980s and 90s meant protracted stints patrolling the wind-lashed hills of South Lebanon. I saw fine Israeli soldiers, veterans of elite units, break from the physical and psychological strain. Returning home, I experienced a sense of disconnect that affects so many combat veterans. How could I be one moment playing with my children in the living room and then drive only a few hours to a bunker where total strangers tried to shoot me?
Because Israel at the time and to this day still has mandatory military conscription of all citizens, the war was felt by the entire population. Because if you hadn't gone, then someone you knew definitely had. But because the war was mostly fought by the Southern Lebanon Army, and was, relatively speaking, a pretty low-temperature conflict, it has disappeared from public consciousness over time. These events were important when they were going on, and left intense personal memories. But they left barely any collective memory at all. What remains are a few dramatic incidents vaguely recalled. related to each other in ways no longer entirely clear. The period doesn't even have a name. Though hardly distant, it is already sinking into the depths behind us, soon to be unrecoverable. Now, for many my age and younger, this may sound crazy, but in early 1990, the Middle East was not the foreign policy hotspot we think of it today. Everybody was afraid that the Soviet Union might explode in a flurry of violence, while the Middle East was, at best, an afterthought. As this Foreign Affairs article from February of that year said,
"In the absence of such storm warnings on the strategic horizon, there was no clear incentive for aggressive American involvement in the Middle East. No obvious penalty for passivity. Therefore, not at all surprising that the initial inclination of the Bush administration was to minimize its investment of effort to build capital in the area."
But everything changed when the Iraqis attacked. After an 8-year stalemate with Iran resulted in a white peace, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait in August of 1990, giving Iraq control of 20% of the world's oil reserves, as he was also eyeing up Saudi oil fields along the Gulf. After ignoring the Middle East for the better part of a decade, the US now had to shift focus. But the Gulf monarchs were hesitant at first to accept US protection. They saw the fall of the Shah in 1979, along with the US withdrawal from Beirut in 1984, as evidence that the US was an unreliable partner, unwilling to accept sustained casualties. The military was also apprehensive about intervention, with the memories of both Vietnam and Lebanon at front of mind. Despite everybody's doubts, the Saudi government approved the buildup of US troops in their country, and the US military committed to a long-term presence in the region. Despite having troops on the ground in Lebanon, the Israelis were far more concerned about Iraq. Saddam Hussein had a history of genocidal remarks about Israel, and a nuclear weapons program he boasted he would use one day to wipe Israel off the map. Additionally, the Israelis were also concerned about the ongoing Palestinian rebellion, or Intifada, during which the number of IDF patrolling the security zone went down. And these two issues combined when just days after, Yasser Arafat and the PLO endorsed Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. Well, the Israelis were busy conducting their own secret diplomacy. The Kingdom of Jordan had publicly sided with Iraq, whom the Israelis feared might launch an attack against them. A secret meeting between King Hussein and Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir was held in the UK. The Iraqis had been flying reconnaissance planes over Jordan, and the Israelis feared these might be used as a cover for an Iraqi bombing of Israel. So Shamir wanted to ensure that they would have the ability to intercept these aircraft without getting caught in a fight with Jordan as well. After several hours of negotiation, the Israelis were given approval to use Jordanian airspace to attack Iraq if necessary. Over the fall of 1990, the US built up an international coalition to liberate Kuwait, and on January 16, 1991, an aerial bombing campaign began. Saddam, hoping to break off Arab and Muslim support from the coalition, began launching Scud missiles at Israel, anticipating a retaliatory strike. Israeli civilians would have to seek shelter from the attacks, as those in northern Israel had been doing since the 1970s. Shamir wanted to retaliate, and not doing so not only kept Israeli civilians in danger for longer, but it also killed the political careers of those in charge while it happened. There were even rumors that some of these missile attacks reached Lebanon.
I can think of nothing that went more against my grain as a Jew and a Zionist, nothing more opposed to the ideology on which my life has been based, to ask the people of Israel to accept the burden of restraint in the face of attack.
But against the wishes of his defense minister, Moshe Arens, Shamir held back at the request of President Bush, who wanted to maintain his international coalition. In return for this, the U.S. sent a team to Tel Aviv to operate Patriot missile launchers to shoot down Saddam's Scuds. But some Israelis were resentful of this, seeing it as an undermining of their sense of independence. A young Benjamin Netanyahu was working at the foreign ministry at the time, and was frequently tasked with speaking to the foreign press outlets, and during one interview was briefly interrupted by a Scud missile landing behind him.
I must say that this is the darnest way to conduct an interview.
At the time, he had opposed Shamir's decision to not retaliate, but later came to agree with it.
It wasn't that Israel wasn't up for the fight. We were more than willing to do our share. But why send our forces when others were willing and able to do the job in keeping with their own national interests, especially when they asked us not to join the effort?
By February 15th, Saddam gave up and agreed to obey UN Resolution 660. The Gulf War was over, and in another surprise to people around my age, people were actually really optimistic about the idea of there being lasting peace in the Middle East. 1988 saw both the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the PLO signing the Algiers Declaration. Ayatollah Khomeini had died in 1989. The Lebanese Civil War had ended in 1990, and Iraq had been roundly defeated in 1991. Even the Israeli public was anticipating a more peaceful future. Combined with the disintegration of the USSR, it really did look like President Bush was overseeing the emergence of a new world order, and he wanted to use this momentum to finally resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all.
Not only did Desert Storm accomplish its political objective, it started to reverse the climate of chronic hostility in the Middle East. President Bush had said that Saddam's aggression would not stand. He had delivered. Now, when he told the Congress that we would work to produce Arab-Israeli peace, no one in the Arab world seemed to doubt him.
Now, the Israeli public may have been optimistic about peace with the Arab states, but between the ongoing First Intifada, as well as the PLO and Arafat cheering on the Scud missile attacks against Israel, they were not so enthused about peace with the Palestinians. Despite this, the State Department began drafting plans for a peace conference and developed a list of actions that each side could do to show the other that they were serious. The Arabs needed to promote credible Palestinian leaders from within the territories, share intelligence on terrorist activities, as well as give warnings about upcoming military exercises. The Arab states were also encouraged to allow Israeli journalists and students into their countries and to end the economic boycotts and declare an end to the state of war between themselves and Israel. The Israelis, in turn, were asked to ease the conditions of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, agree to some kind of association between the territories and Jordan, declare a willingness to pull out of Lebanon, and agree to a peace settlement based on UN Resolutions 242 and 338. Between the Gulf War and the U.S. push for a regional peace conference, the Lebanon War fell further into the background, despite being very divisive within Israeli society. But the new chief of staff, Ehud Barak, would try to minimize IDF casualties by shifting its strategy toward more air power. And in May 1991, Hezbollah would begin going through internal reorganization with the election of a new general secretary. The office of general secretary had been created in 1989 and was first occupied by one of Hezbollah's founders, Subhi al-Tufayli. He took power around the time Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in Iran, and they had diverging visions for the organization's role in Lebanon. Tufayli wanted Hezbollah to remain more independent from Iran, but this was mostly due to the change in Iranian leadership. Ayatollah Khomeini had opposed Hezbollah getting involved in the politics of Lebanon, instead wanting them to establish an Islamic theocracy, which lined up with Tufayli's own ideology. But the new Ayatollah was more pragmatic than his predecessor, and encouraged Hezbollah to participate in Lebanese politics. Within the upper echelons, Tufayli was opposed by Abbas al-Musawi and Hassan Nasrallah, who both sided with the Iranian regime and believed they should adjust Hezbollah's tactics to match the new realities of Lebanon. And thanks to Iranian influence, Tufayli was ousted from the leadership and Musawi was elected in his place. Under Musawi's leadership, Hezbollah withdrew from a number of the fortifications that they had taken over from the Israelis and let the Lebanese army occupy them instead. They also wanted to have better relations with foreign journalists, so they went so far as to open a press office in order to accept more interviews with them. And these decisions would ease the relations between Hezbollah and Syria, who wanted to maintain peace between the Lebanese factions. Meanwhile, throughout the spring and summer of 1991, the U.S. State Department continued their effort to get the Arabs and Israelis together in one room. Secretary of State James Baker would make his first visit to Israel in March of 1991, which was conspicuously late. Unlike his predecessor George Shultz, James Baker was notably less pro-Israel than his Reagan administration predecessors. In a conversation in the White House, Baker is alleged to have said in reference to Jewish Americans, "Fuck them, they didn't vote for us." For his part, Baker claims that what he actually said was, "Screw them, they don't vote for us," and that this line was in reference to the American Israel Political Action Committee, or AIPAC. The dueling quotes, of course, are in dispute. Shamir would tell Baker that he was open to some kind of confederation between Jordan and the Palestinian territories. Baker offered to have U.S. troops stationed in the Golans in exchange for Israel returning the territory to Syria, which Shamir was also open to. Additionally, Baker's director for policy planning, Dennis Ross, was meeting with some of the up-and-coming leaders of the Likud, including future Prime Ministers Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Olmert, both of whom were strongly in favor of negotiations. However, the Israelis had stipulations over the nature of the negotiations. The Palestinians would have to be part of the Jordanian delegation, and they had to explicitly renounce the PLO. They also wanted the conference to accept the Camp David understandings of UN Resolutions 242 and 338, which the Arab states absolutely refused. none of them wanting to be associated with the agreement that got Sadat assassinated, while the Palestinians would never renounce the PLO. In place of those stipulations, Baker and Ross got Shamir to agree to come with the understanding that if the Palestinians appeared to be acting on behalf of the PLO, the Israelis would walk out of the meeting. The biggest holdout of the conference was Hafez al-Assad, whom the Americans, Egyptians, and Saudis all began meeting with to convince him. When Baker met with Assad, he told him about his proposal to have U.S. soldiers stationed in the Golans in exchange for Israeli withdrawal, which Assad rejected, saying,
"The land is important. It connotes dignity and honor. A man is not chosen to go to paradise unless he can do so in a dignified way. We don't want anyone to say we have given up what we have been talking about for 20 years.
But by May, they finally got Assad to agree to the conference, so long as the UN had a presence and that the US was willing to guarantee the border. The conference would be held in Madrid in October 1991, with Israel meeting with delegations from Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. There was also a Palestinian delegation which was supposed to be part of the Jordanian one, but was largely allowed to act independently. And although none of the Palestinian delegates were currently members of the PLO, the Jordanians didn't dare appoint anybody who didn't have Arafat's blessing. Most of the participants sent their respective foreign ministers, but Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir had decided that he would attend the meeting himself, but would be accompanied by the new Deputy Foreign Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. The conference saw Arab delegates repeating the same lines and demands they had been making for decades, with the Israelis giving the same retorts. The Syrians even had the nerve to call themselves a bastion of freedom, to which Shamir responded by condemning their prolonged occupation of Lebanon, all the while trying to reassure the Lebanese delegation that Israel had no desire to annex or settle Lebanese territory. The only thing that came out of the Madrid conference was an agreement to continue negotiations between the Arab states and Israel in Washington, D.C. The Israelis refused to meet with the Palestinian delegation so long as Faisal al-Husseini was there, due to him maintaining very close contacts with the PLO, and with widespread belief that he was behind the First Intifada. Talks with the Palestinians resumed when al-Husseini was removed from the delegation, but he was kept on as an advisor, which in reality meant he was still connecting with Arafat. At this time, the United Nations was also going through a change in leadership. In January 1992, the former Foreign Minister of Egypt, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, was elected Secretary General. Boutros-Ghali was the Egyptian representative that negotiated the Camp David Accords back in 1978, and he wanted to repair the relationship between Israel and the UN. Beginning in the 1970s, the UN became increasingly hostile towards Israel, which began with General Assembly Resolutions 3236 and 3237, which recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This was followed up by UN Assembly Resolution 3379, which redefined Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. This was followed up by the UN's condemnation of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1978, which was followed up by the creation of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, which was supposed to restore order in the south in order to stop the PLO from firing rockets into northern Israel, but it never did, and from that point has had a history of underreporting attacks made against Israel by the PLO and later by Hezbollah. Boutros-Ghali came into office wanting to rectify this history, and in his inaugural speech said,
"At Camp David, I contributed to the achievement of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. I would now like to conclude a peace treaty between the United Nations and Israel."
His efforts began before he entered office, by getting General Assembly Resolution 4686 passed, which revoked Resolution 3379 that declared Zionism to be a form of racism. This was followed up by him persuading the Arab states to cease their annual attempt to get Israel expelled from the UN. This was followed by Israelis finally being allowed to serve in various UN positions from which they had been informally prohibited.
The problems of the Arab world were interwoven with the goal of pan-Islamic solidarity. Not only for fundamentalists, but for many Arabs, the sole entity is the Muslim nation, the Ummah, which must take precedence over the Arab nation. One must without reservation support Muslims in Bosnia and Kashmir and Chechnya and Cyprus and Nagorno-Karabakh. Not to do so would be anti-Muslim and thus anti-Arab.
Despite these positive movements at the UN, the IDF made an unintentionally momentous decision in Lebanon. On top of general military actions, the IDF also orchestrated assassinations of Hezbollah leaders, and on February 16, 1992, they assassinated the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Abbas al-Musawi. The IDF didn't differentiate between leaders of Hezbollah, seeing them all as equally radical and militant. But under Musawi, Hezbollah had been more restrained, wanting to focus on building up political support to eventually win control of parliament. A helicopter raid had been planned, with the original mission being to kidnap Musawi in hopes of either trading him for Israelis still held hostage, or for the remains of other hostages that were killed. But when the helicopter arrived, they found too many other Hezbollah gunmen around to make capturing him viable. So they fell back to Plan B, which was to assassinate him. But in the process of doing so, Musawi's wife and child were caught in the crossfire. Hezbollah used the death of Musawi's wife and child as an excuse to launch rockets into northern Israel, which the Israelis retaliated against by striking several Hezbollah sites just north of the security zone. Everyone was afraid that this might escalate into a full-blown incursion like in 1982. So the Shia cleric, Sayyid Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, tried to save face for Hezbollah by saying that they didn't need to continue the rocket attacks because the Israelis had already withdrawn back to the security zone, while Lebanon's Prime Minister, Omar Karami, declared the rocket attacks to not be a valid act of resistance. The previous General Secretary, al-Tufayli, tried to win re-election to the post, but the Iranians would put their fingers on the scale, swaying the election to Hassan Nasrallah. Although both Musawi and Nasrallah had wanted Hezbollah to reorganize in order to better take advantage of Lebanese politics at the time, but Nasrallah despised the Syrians as a bunch of pagan heretics, while Musawi wanted to work with them. But more importantly, although Nasrallah supported greater involvement of Hezbollah in regular electoral politics, he wanted to focus all of its material assets towards the war with Israel and its destruction. If the Israelis had any illusions that Hezbollah would be tempered by the killing of Musawi, Nasrallah's promotion quickly disabused them of it. Compared with Musawi, Nasrallah was a wild-eyed radical. It turned out that even black has its shades. Nasrallah was blacker than black. After the rocket attacks, Nasrallah tried to play down Hezbollah's involvement, claiming it was launched by some group they were allied to but didn't have control of. Despite this, firing rockets at Israeli civilians would become his policy for responding to the death of a Lebanese civilian. Of course, there are two huge asterisks attached to this policy. Firstly, they would not respond to the death of all Lebanese civilians, only the ones that were killed by the Israelis or their allies, and only when they actually felt like they needed to. And secondly, Hezbollah would continue to embed themselves in communities throughout southern Lebanon so that the Israelis could not strike them without hitting civilian targets. At the funeral of Musawi, Nasrallah would say,
Israel will always be for us a cancerous growth that needs to be eradicated and an artificial entity that should be removed. The Islamic resistance will remain our only option, our constant response, the path we shall not relinquish, and the battle we will pursue even if the entire world surrenders.
The funeral was followed up by 5 days of rocket fire into northern Israel, the greatest number since 1982, which killed a 6-year-old Israeli girl, Avia al-Assad. The IDF would respond again by shelling Shiite villages north of the security zone. In pursuit of his more hostile approach to Israel, Nasrallah would appoint Imad Mughniya as Hezbollah's military chief. Mughniya was the mastermind behind the U.S. barracks and embassy bombings of 1983, along with many other attacks. Under his leadership, Hezbollah would begin building up its conventional arms to be used in tandem with terrorism abroad. Mughniya actively expanded Hezbollah's targets to include any and all Jews abroad, treating them all as legitimate targets regardless of their nationality or affiliations. And he initiated 3 terror attacks in March 1992, each escalating in scale and casualties. On March 3rd, a bomb went off near a synagogue in Istanbul. 4 days later, the chief of security for Israel's Turkish embassy was killed by a car bomb. And on March 17th, another car bomb hit the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, killing 29 people, 20 of whom were children. Mughniya had planned these attacks years in advance, with 45 sleeper cells scattered around the world, waiting for orders to implement other attacks. The Israelis were uncertain of how to respond to these attacks. The Mossad would have to be drastically reorganized to start hunting down Hezbollah in Latin America, and thus they decided to write off the Buenos Aires attack as a one-off and pass the responsibility onto the IDF, Amman, and Shin Bet. Parliamentary elections came to Israel in June 1992. By that point, Likud had been part of every government as either the leading party or as part of a coalition since 1977, and Yitzhak Shamir hoped to lead them to another victory, allowing them to keep up the negotiations with the Arabs in Washington. Meanwhile, Labor had their own internal election in which Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, both former prime ministers, sought the leadership of the party. Believing stronger security credentials would stand up better against Likud, Rabin was chosen to lead the party in the election, and that election would turn on security concerns. Despite having restrained Israeli military action on request of the Americans, allowing Israel to get hit by Saddam's Scud missiles dealt a massive blow to Shamir's popularity. Additionally, his willingness to negotiate with the Palestinians at Madrid and in Washington hurt his credibility on the right. And on top of this was the ongoing First Intifada. For his part, during the election, Rabin had promised to not push any major left-wing policies and to crush the terrorists. Before the election, Parliament would pass a bill transforming future Israeli elections, by making the position of Prime Minister elected by a popular vote. In Israel, there was a history of small parliamentary factions breaking down a government over policy, which threatened a Prime Minister's ability to conduct long-term plans. Rabin, who was leading in the polls, supported this measure, and he had an ally across the aisle, Benjamin Netanyahu. However, this policy was not popular amongst Likud's membership, and threatened to remove any members who voted for it from the party list, which he managed to avoid by conducting a vigorous internal party campaign. The bill would pass, resulting in the next election, scheduled for 1996, to have the prime minister elected by popular vote. There were too many factors working against Likud in this election, and thus it led to the near-inevitable victory for Labor and Yitzhak Rabin. All of Israel's problems, the war, the negotiations, and the Palestinian terrorism were all his now, and his prime ministership would be one of hope and tragedy. Thanks again to my patrons for supporting the channel for the past few months. In particular, I would like to thank the newest patrons who joined in the months of January and February: Cody, David, Ben, and Muhammad. Your support helps keep the lights on here at Casual Historian HQ. If you're interested in supporting this channel and all the perks that entails, then check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.